1. All right, now we are recording. So on today's episode, for episode 10, I have my guest, Dr. Karlee Fellner, who is a registered psychologist and also a podcast hostess of... Okay, you're going to have to intervene. You're good. This is where I'm going to have to say cut, and you're probably going to have to introduce the podcast because I am not familiar with our native language as of yet.
Well, the podcast itself is Soul Medicine Ancient Psychologies for Wellness, and it's on the Mesquite Wellness YouTube channel.
Yeah, Mesquite. There we go. Mesquite Wellness. So that was clearly a little hiccup in the introduction of episode 10, but I am sure that whoever is listening or viewing this episode is probably tuning in for all of the hot mess that comes along with this episode. So thank you for joining us for episode 10. It is, you know what? That's annoying. It is a pleasure to be having you for the 10th episode. So, meaning that season 1 of the Indigenous Central podcast, we are officially at the halfway mark, the halfway milestone for season 1, which is exciting. I am definitely looking forward to the next 10 episodes for season 1 and for season 2. If everyone sticks around long enough, you will be seeing some exciting new things happening for season 2. There will probably be a new introduction for the episodes. I'm thinking of looking into hopefully a new music for the introduction and also for the outro of the episodes, and hopefully you might see us around on either Spotify or Apple Music for season 2, which is exciting. So with that being said, the first question is where we will be asking Dr. Karlee Fellner to be introducing herself. Would you mind explaining in your own words who Dr. Karlee Fellner is?
For sure. That's a big question. So I'll start with a little intro and we'll see where it goes. Tanse chante hoashe wia miwete esqueo netsiga san katoyesaki netsiga san Karlee Fellner munya wihuin Alberta Otsania. So my names are Good-Hearted Woman and Sweet Pine Woman. I am a member of the Metis Nation of Alberta. My family was relocated from Beaver Lake Cree Nation up by Lac La Biche through the half-breed script process and moved out near a little place called Round Hill. I don't know if you know where that is. It's a little obscure, but it's not too far from Camrose, which is about an hour southeast of Edmonton. So I was born in Camrose, and then when I was a year old, my parents moved to Devon. So I grew up in Devon, just southwest of Edmonton. Was there for the first part of my life, basically, or first half of my life, I should say. And then from there, kind of started moving around for school and for work. So I went to school at the University of Alberta in Edmonton for my first 2 degrees. I did a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, the cooperative work experience program that they have, where you work for a year full time. I worked at Rosehaven Care Center, which is a geriatric psychiatric facility in Camrose, actually. So back to the place of my birth for a year there. And then I did my master's of counseling psych at U of A. And then after that, ended up moving out to Vancouver to Coast Salish territories to do my PhD at UBC in counseling psych. And then I was all over the place. I got an academic position at the University of Calgary, 2013, moved there, had to finish off my doc degree. So I moved out to Minneapolis, Minnesota for a year for my internship, and then back to Calgary, where I continued to stay until 2023. In 2023, I resigned my academic position as I was a professor of counseling psychology and Indigenous education at the university there. And I decided to kind of dive headfirst into the work that I had been spending my career doing, which was looking at, best practices in Indigenous approaches to wellness and, quote unquote mental health. I don't like that term because it's really about our holistic wellness with Indigenous people and communities. And so I left the university and moved out to Rocky Mountain House, of all places. So back in rural Alberta, and got a little piece of land there because land is the heart of our wellness, the heart of Indigenous approaches to wellness. And I've been living in all these cities and towns my whole life. And so, I had founded Muskegee Wellness, and Muskegee means medicine in Plains Cree, just refer to all of the things that help us in a good way and support our wellness in a good way, our healing, all that good stuff. And I had founded Muskegee in 2021, just kind of, a little thing on the side while I was still in academia, but decided to dive in head first when I left the academy. And I did have a little one in 2024, so I was on mat leave for a good chunk of time. But since the spring of 2025, I have pretty much full on been into Muskegee, started the Soul Medicine podcast. So that's a lot of my life is doing that work, right? And living the work, doing land-based approaches to therapy, community-driven approaches to wellness. And in addition to that, I'm a mom to two little people. So one is a year and a half old and the other one is 5 years old. So I'm busy, needless to say.
Yes.
I've got a lot going on.
Yeah, it sounds like a roller coaster from what I'm gathering. And I am glad that you brought up your experience within psychology, but also your experience with researching and discovering the holistic side, holistic wellness side of the Indigenous way of life, because that is something else that personally, by my experience and by my own witness account, is it's not out there in the mainstream as much as it should be, and which is sad, especially within mainstream media. And as many of our viewers, or as some of our viewers and listeners will know, that I have explained in previous episodes, the reason for starting the podcast was to have a platform, a safe and a community-based public space for Indigenous professionals, whether that's in medicine, that's in law, that's in science, that's in health and wellness, that's in beauty. So having the opportunity to have Dr. Fellner on episode 10, I'm hoping that as we continue on with the questions and we continue on with the episode, we can also bleed into the pros and cons, and also the societal differences that we as Indigenous people have seen, have experienced, have heard, and have felt not having our practices. First of all, getting into the itty gritty and getting into the raw depth of history. In the beginning, before Canada, before United States, before Mexico, and before these imaginary borders, it was one continuum continent, one continuum place, and that was Turtle Island. And for many of us, from what I've heard and from what I've read, Turtle Island, there was a lot of international tribal, like not international, but intertribal trading, intertribal coexistence. And for us to go back to even something that resembles the past before pre-colonization, there needs to be a lot of discussions done there, as I've also mentioned in previous episodes, in a way to have those conversations, and for it to tie into reconciliation and into the steps of reconciliation to where it creates a ripple effect of forevermore change. There needs to be the uncomfortable conversations, and especially over the uncomfortable topics and the topics that are very well debated and well known to be controversial. But nonetheless, for us to go back to honing in, not just through smudging and through prayer and having that spiritual cleanse and that mental offload, there needs to be a way of getting back to the practices through smudging, through ceremony, through using your five senses, through seeing, through speaking the truth, for seeing a clear path, for speaking your truth, for smelling your way through the dangers of life, and for hearing what the Creator and for what the voices and the people around you have to say, but also when it comes to your touch, to be in tune with your heart and your soul and your mind through touch, so that you can feel your way through the world. And using your five senses, I learned that while forming my own prayer for whenever I smudge. I haven't smudged in a long time, sort of, but I will after this episode. And thank you for the smudging prior to this episode. I'm starting to feel that the smoke arising on my end. But I will smudge after this episode. A well-needed smudge needs to happen. Need to return back to praying. But that being said, for us to return back to even something that is even similar or parallel or closely resembles pre-colonization times, there needs to be a lot of lateral love, lateral support. And I talked about this with my previous guest on episode 9, where there's a lot of lateral violence within Indigenous communities. And she shared that through her own experiences of how she's seen that there's been a lot of jealousy, and that there's been a lot of judgment, and there's been a lot of hateful just interactions with her. She's a full-time beater, and how she's explained that fellow beatisans and fellow artisans, they're sort of gatekeeping their art, they're gatekeeping their patterns, which there can be an understanding drawn from that for gatekeeping something that you've created. But at the same time, we were not raised on gatekeeping. We were not raised on this lateral hatred or this lateral negativity. We were raised to help each other. If there was a child who we knew lost their mom and dad, and all they had left was the tribe and the community, the tribe come together and raise that child. So this gatekeeping nonsense, it does not align with the teachings, nor the core values, nor the TP teachings of love, of community, of respect, and all the other teachings of the 13 poles of the TP. It veers completely 180 or even 360 away from the teachings and away from where we came from as holistic beings, which was we weren't just one person. We were one family, we were one lodging, we were one house, and we were one tribe. And not only was it one tribe or one family or one lodging, it was 10, 20 families within a tribe, within a lodging. And you would go around sharing responsibilities, and you'd go around sharing the wisdom and the knowledge, but also you would take turns raising each other's children. In a way, the aunties and the uncles within the tribe, they would look after their nieces and nephews. And it was before the term babysitter was thrown around. They were caretakers, they were caregivers, they looked after the children, but they weren't babysitting them. It was a shared communal responsibility, and including the harvest and the hunt. You shared what you hunted and harvest. You shared it with everyone. If there was one teepee that was low on food, there was no such thing as homelessness. There was no such thing as going days without food, going without to eat. It was a shared responsibility. And for us to even remotely go back to, because I know I've heard how people are going back to reclaiming natives, reclaiming their language, but you cannot reclaim anything that merely or even closely represents or reflects reclaiming your native heritage unless you learn the lateral love and the lateral respect and the back and forth of intertribalness within each Indigenous person. And that is very much lacking. And that is what I see is lacking, not only from what I've heard with my previous guest in episode 9, but also from what I've seen is there's gatekeeping, there's judging, there's sneering at one another, there's jealousy, there's putting someone down. I'm not seeing a lot. I'm seeing little bits and pieces of members who are picking up the little broken bits and pieces, but it is truly not going to be reflective, nor is it going to be a full 360 or a full sphere, a full circle of returning back to our old ways, unless it starts with Indigenous people first. It has to be the self-love, the self-respect, and in turn sharing that intertribally, intergenerationally, and intercommunity base. But we're not seeing that, and a whole part of our holistic being is loving ourselves and praying and smudging, but also do unto others as how you would have done unto you. But hey, I'm just one person and I'm just one big mouth. So veering off of holistic wellness and holistic well-being, there needs to be a lot of steps taken back, a lot of reflection, and a lot of looking over of ourselves and of our tribe and of our nations and our communities before we can even talk about reconciliation with the outsider, with the white man, with the white person. It has to start with us first.
Yeah, the values, right? Like you're talking about the values, our Inuak Indigenous people's values, and looking at what are the values of the colonial society, because that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
And the values of that colonial society drive the culture of that colonial society. It is a society of divide, conquer, competition, greed, fear. Everything's based out of fear, right? And it's very much centered in the ego. And so when we return to our values, like you're talking about, we center everything in spirit and faith and those teachings that you're talking about, right? Of love, of humility, of respect. And it can be as simple as that, as making a commitment, for ourselves, because we have to do it, on the individual level. It starts with each of us. You know, we have to be looking inward, like you're saying, and how am I bringing love into the world? How am I living the values? What are the ways that colonial values have seeped into me? And how
Yes.
do I undo them, right?
Mhm.
Noticing when you're feeling that competitiveness or that fear of scarcity, and noticing that, stepping back and coming into the values, like you say, because we can absolutely unequivocally live traditional values in today's world. And like you're saying, it's so important, you know,
Yes.
and one of those bases, like you're talking about the collective, because even when we talk about wellness, you know, it's our individual wellness doesn't exist outside of the collective. Everything is we, right? We are a collective.
Mhm.
We're a reflection of the collective. You know, within our value systems, every single member of the community was valued for their gifts, right? All gifts
Yes.
were welcomed, all gifts were appreciated, all brains, you know, were appreciated, all of the inherent diversity of what it means to come into this world as a totally unique, awesome human being and to bring your gifts to the collective. There was never this sense of like, you know, well, I'm this and that person can't be that. No way, because we always knew that we need all the gifts for the community, right? So those things like jealousy and greed and what you're talking about, those are very much a part of the culture of colonialism, right?
Mhm.
And those have deep roots. You know, I feel like I'm always talking about tracing back the empire, right?
Yes.
Tracing back the British and French and Spanish empires to the Roman Empire, and just looking at like what
Mhm.
were people coming over the ocean with, you know what I mean? And their own surviving of their own genocides and wiping people out over there before
Mhm.
that came over this way to Turtle
Yes.
Island. And just seeing, you know, the incredible fear that people were coming here with. And,
Mhm.
you know, we see that reflected in the world today, right? So absolutely, like you're saying, our values are the pathway back to wellness,
Mhm.
you know, and that starts with each and every single one of us, you know, with, because I mean, it's such a real thing. And you know, and I can say all this stuff, and don't get me wrong, it hurts, right? It's really shitty
Yep.
when people are coming after you, or you know, coming at you with that lateral violence. And
Yep.
um and there's that understanding of like, okay, you can trace the origins of that back, you know, all
Mhm.
the way through the Roman Empire and beyond, kind of thing. um and just continuing to recenter in the value.
Mhm.
You know, I think about that, one of my favorite Cree words, you know, kiam, just let it be, right? That teaching of, it's not okay. People do need to step into accountability and responsibility, absolutely. But for each of us, you know, on our end, to be able to let that go, you know, when people aren't yet doing that work, and it's coming out on us, right? It's
Mhm.
hard. It's hard, but you know, at the same time, I really see Indigenous folks leading the way also
Mhm.
in our values and our healing and our wellness, and reminding the world, wait a sec, we need to get right and
Yeah.
live in good relation with all of our relations, right?
Mhm.
And there are people doing that every day. You know, our elders, our knowledge holders, Kitiayak, they remind us, you know, to pray for those that are still in
Mhm.
struggle, that are still hurting, and they're still hurting others out of their hurt, right?
Mhm.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
Going back to my personal experience, I know that, and I'm going to use an example from the white folks' Bible. And there's going to be people who will come after me for saying that, but I'm going to use the example of the fourth commandment amongst the 10 commandments, which some of the 10 commandments parallel to our own teachings. But in the fourth commandment, it talks about honoring your father and mother. I personally have not always done that. And I have a deep feeling that somewhere in my being, there is a seeding or a seedling of something that I cannot yet identify that is most likely leading to me going against that commandment of honoring thy mother and thy father, which I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a renowned Catholic or a reowning, or I'm not an active member, but because my mom was a residential school survivor and because that's all she knew, she began teaching me about the Bible and about the Christian faith since I was a young kid. And still to this day, it's sad, but I'm learning to find my way around it. My mom, she does not participate in her own cultural practices, whereas I do, or at least I try my best to remind myself to do so, such as smudging. But again, going back to that commandment, I haven't always leaned towards being consistent or being continuous with that commandment. I've certainly had my ups and downs with my mom, and we certainly don't have a close relationship. I know, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't trust my mom with my finances, or I wouldn't trust my mom to do many things. I don't trust her to be so much as an emergency contact, which is sad because colonization really got to my mom. And for many it got to many of our loved ones, but our loved ones were always able, like an elastic, like elasticity, were always able to return back to their teachings and back to what they grew up knowing. But I have a feeling, I have a deep-rooted feeling, and also a sad feeling that my mom wasn't one of those people. She made it home alive. Her body made it home. Her person made it home, but her spirit is still lost, or was left behind. She wasn't fully returned home to us.
Yeah, it's, I'm thinking about survivance. That's what's coming to mind for me. And that's like one of my favorite words. It's a word that was created by Gerald Visner, who's White Earth Anishinaabe from Minnesota. He is a scholar in Indigenous literature. And I remember coming across this term survivance when I was studying my PhD. He published about it in 1999, and I was like, where is this word in psychology? We need this word in psychology. But he created that term, to highlight Inuit Indigenous peoples' survivance through attempted genocide and our survivance since time immemorial, right? Thousands and thousands of years, that we don't only exist in relation to colonialism, but that we have persisted and resisted and survived through so much over the past thousands and thousands of years. And really looking into modes of survivance, right? And how those shift and change as the context shifts and changes. I remember when because I wasn't brought up practicing our cultural practices, our ceremonies, our language. However, what I did realize once I was a couple of years into ceremony, attending and helping and just learning and learning and learning was that I was raised with the values. That's how I was brought up, like core to my being is that love, that humility, you know, our teachings. And I remember early in my journey, before I kind of had that realization, you know, I started, it was really 2010 where I started attending ceremony a lot. I basically dove in head first because I was moving into a time in my life where I was shifting and starting to focus my work on best practices in mental and, you know, and wellness with Indigenous peoples. And so it's like, well, I got to live it, right? Like this isn't something you study from the outside. And so I need to get to know who I am as an Indigenous woman and what that means to me, right? And so, you know, diving into ceremony, and at first I was so mad at my ancestors. Like, I remember just being mad. Like, why didn't you pass on the language to me? Why didn't you pass on the ceremonies? You know, all this stuff. And wow, you know, and I was young and fiery at the time, and really just learning and realizing, right? And it wasn't too long, thankfully. I think even within like a month or two of kind of feeling that anger, or even less, I don't know. But having this realization of like, duh, you know, I might not be alive today if my ancestors didn't do what they needed to do for me to survive, right? And when I think about survivance stories and all of our family's survivance stories, because that's one of the things, you know, I had in my mind back then, you know, over 15 years ago now, I had this very colonial idea that I didn't realize was a colonial idea, that like, you know, in Indigenous survivance, as I would have understood it, was like the people that kept the ceremonies going in the bush, the people that kept smudging when it was illegal, you know, the people that kept speaking their language under, you know, under their breath and behind, you know, in safe places. And that I didn't realize that was a totally colonial perspective that I had. And as I, you know, really started unraveling all of this colonial indoctrination that I had, which that was part of, I realized these are all survivance stories, right? I mean, yes, absolutely. All of that I always thought was part of survivance was part of survivance. And all of our ancestors who did whatever else they needed to do, whether it was converting, you know, to the religion that was being forced upon folks, or whether it was stopping speaking the language, so, you know, it was all ways that people were surviving attempted genocide. People just they did what they needed to do to survive, right? To stay alive. And it was critical for them to do whatever they needed to do to stay alive. And all those stories look different in all of our families. And I believe, you know, in my perspective, all of those stories are to be honored, right? Who am I to sit here in a time that I can attend ceremony without persecution and judge my ancestors, right? They didn't want to let go of their ceremonies. They didn't want, you know, they did what they had to do to survive. You know, and so I really had to like, whoa, you know, kind of apologize to my ancestors and through my lineage. And realize like, no, like they did whatever they needed to do to survive, you know, and that's a beautiful thing, and it's to be honored. So even when we're thinking about some of the lateral oppression that comes up of people judging folks for like, oh, well, you didn't grow up this way, or you're not this, or you're not that. It's like, man, like our ancestors were doing what they needed to do to survive, right? The fact that we are Indigenous and we are still here after over 500 years of attempting to eradicate us, that's fucking incredible. You know what I mean? Like that is incredible. It is survivance. It is beautiful, you know, and I'm trained in an approach called Indigenous focusing oriented therapy, which I'm just like obsessed with. But one of the concepts that was made really explicit in IFOT was and it's part of Indigenous worldviews, like even globally, this and but I thought made it explicit of like there's the and right, so we acknowledge the survivance stories, and we also pick up that responsibility, that accountability to wellness, right? And so I'm able to acknowledge, that say within my family or anyone else's family who we're talking about, there are going to be people who may never, step foot in ceremony again, who may never pick up the smudge again and all of that. And that's okay. That's okay because they've done what they needed to do to survive. And our healing and our wellness is collective too. So I know when I pick up the smudge, when I walk a path of ceremony and live in our values, and I do my work of healing and undoing, that's going to ripple out into my web of relations, which ultimately is all of our relations, right? Everybody and every cosmos. But I know that even if I never explicitly see some shifts that I may like to or want to see among some of, my relatives or friends, people I care for, I know that there's still, those ripples of healing and wellness and reclamation are still moving through that web. I had this incredible experience once. This was just a couple of years ago. And I was having a little bit of energy work done on me by an Indigenous practitioner that has this gift of, working with energy. And there was just like this big block in my chest. And I was like, oh, what's that about? I'm the way that I work as a therapist too, is always working through the body. Right. And I'm kind of like, whoa, what's going on? And I could sense it. And he was sensing it as he was doing that energy work. And anyways, I basically just, this kind of vision opened up, I guess, for lack of a better word. I don't know what else to call it, but an experience where all of a sudden I realized, I just started crying and crying and crying, and it wasn't my tears, and I knew it wasn't my tears. And I realized that this block was my great grandmother's grief. And she had held me as a baby. She passed away of cancer not too long after I came into this world. But she had held me as a baby, and all of a sudden I was transported to that moment, and she was holding me. Oh gosh, I'm gonna get emotional. And she was just overcome with grief that I would not have the ceremonies, that I would not have the language. And so I'm laying there, this person's doing this energy work, and I'm just crying and crying, and I'm just like, these aren't my tears. I don't know. The tears were just flowing, but then I was having this experience, and it was like, oh my gosh, it's my great grandmother's tears. But realizing it wasn't only her tears, it was my Nana's tears, who passed in 2014, and who I was very, very close with. And it's also the tears of all these grandmothers, right, who have who've held their grandchildren, who've held these babies with this fear that they won't have who they are as Indigenous people, right? And so I'm there, and my great grandma's holding me, and there's just this intense, deep, collective grief that millions of Inuit Indigenous peoples know, that grief of having your land taken, your culture taken, your language taken, or attempts to take. And then there I am as an adult, right? The current present time, a couple of years ago. And I just told her, like, grandma, because that's what I called her. Grandma, it's okay. I'm going to ceremony now.
Yeah.
I'm going to ceremony and I'm learning the language like super, super slowly. I'm not even at a toddler level of Nehio Wewin
Yeah.
because I haven't dedicated the time I need
Mhm.
to. But you know, I pick up pieces as much as I can as I go, and it's like, Grandma, it's okay. Like I'm singing the songs and like, all of this stuff, and I'm just telling her this. And then all of a sudden, we were actually at a gathering, and outside of the space where I was having this energy work done, these women who were there start singing this Cree grandmother's song. just,
Mm.
just so happened. And I see my grandma get it. I see her get it of like, oh my gosh, you're doing it, right? Like the reclamation.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden I just saw her in this beautiful buckskin dress, and
Mm.
she was dancing on the grass, like just like this open area of grass with these trees near her. And just like free, you know, it was like that
Mhm.
was like released. And I'm just like, man, also, you know, how incredible and how beautiful. And that's, you know, for me to have that experience directly
Yeah.
of, of that intergenerational healing, of knowing, seeing, experiencing that, like, yeah, this work is so worthwhile. Reclamation is so worthwhile. You know, coming back into our values, it's so worthwhile because we release those ancestors, you know, who didn't have, you know, who had to do what they had to do to survive, right?
Mhm.
And we're now in a place today where the world, the globe, desperately needs Inuak Indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, being, and doing, right? Like it is critical to the survival of the planet, of humanity, of it's like
Yes.
globally, right? And so when I say that, I do mean, you know, when that term Indigenous means of the land, right? So I mean those knowledges that are local to each of those places globally, because every, you know, square inch of this planet that has had human life on it
Mhm.
has Indigenous peoples to that place with those teachings. You know, and some may be further disconnected from those times, but there's more or less, there's Indigenous peoples that know the lands of each place globally, you know what I mean? And so
Mhm.
there's knowledges and wisdom there that need to be leaned into, for all of our healing and wellness, right?
Mhm.
It's just so crucial, and for all of our relations. So anyways, that was something I was thinking about while you were sharing. I mean, I can go on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I also could go on, but um being that um we are still in a world that is very much there's a word for it. I right now I'm thinking of manipulated, but there's another word for it that is that is being driven by colonial practices and, for lack of a better word, values. Is that, you know, time waits for no one, or time is money, or you don't have enough time in the world, when in fact our teachings talk about time is, you very much you very much go with the time that you are given. So if you need to be in a sweat lodge for more than 7 hours, for more than 24 hours, you sit there, and for the amount of time that the creator gives you, you stay there. There's no running around or racing or panicking or hitting the snooze button or the alarm button or going this and that and making every appointment, and trying to cram it all within a 24-hour day. Um, is very much the reason why I leave an open pathway for each episode and for each guest. Is we can take all the time in the world that we need to and that we want to. It doesn't have to be a 2-hour time slot. It can be 3 hours, it can be 5 hours, but just so as much as in a way we are healing, because there's that form of healing where you talk about it, where you open up and you talk and you have communications, you talk with someone and you socialize with someone, however it may be. So there's that.
I know. I love that so much. I love being in the flow of time and just releasing that, because we're also, I mean, as you know, time is also not linear. Like Iniwak Indigenous
Yes.
people understand that, and we time travel. I mean, I just time traveled to a time travel there when I was sharing that story, and it's incredible how we move through things like that. But yeah, these conversations are medicine. And I'm so glad that you're sharing that with the world through your podcast, all the medicine that you get to share with all your guests.
Yeah, and it needs to be shared. Again, if we're going to go back to anything remotely or closely in regard and similar to the way it was before pre-colonization. I mean, we can talk about all the fancy movements and trends all we want, of the land back, of reconciliation, of now there's a new one coming out where it's saying the F word towards Christopher Columbus, which that is very well needed for some people. For many people, is to go out and voice that as loud as the trees in the grandfather sky will listen to. Is, there's a lot of hatred, but also there's a lot of understanding and a lot of sitting it within their mind that they know where all of this colonial bullshit came from, of the time racing against the clock, getting things done. And I find it very interesting because last night I came across a quote, or rather a video of an explanation, where the people are very much the currency. And the whole reason for birth certificates, because mind you, before pre-colonization, we did not have birth certificates, we did not have hospitals, yada, yada, yada. But birth certificates are a way of a currency for the federal government. Because once you sign up for a birth certificate, once you make it known, a declaration of a birth, now you are an added currency to the country, or I'm not even sure, but to the system. You're another currency value that's added to this system, and they can time you of when your expectancy is and for how long you're expected to work at the retirement age, and they can put you to work in for manual labor or for any type of labor, and you're paying back taxes, and you're paying GST and PST and whatever else, because you're a currency for the government, and in a way you're the leverage, you're the liability of the country. You're the country's liability, the same way that an individual would have liability for their credit, for their debit, and for their credit scores, for their borrowing and their lending. That's very much what we are as people within the country. Is we're the currency, we're the liability for the payback loan or for the payback period.
And corporations, right? It is a big corporation itself.
Yes, it is.
But see, now you're speaking about psychology, because, or at least the dominating mainstream system of psychology, which I always find interesting, right? That's part of why I started the Soul Medicine podcast, was to remind people that the word psychology, like the etiology of that term, is actually the study of the soul. And psychiatry is actually the healing of the soul. And so I think it goes without saying the fields overall have strayed quite far from the origin of those terms. But, you know, whoever came up with the metaphor of a cog in the machine is a brilliant person, because that's exactly what it is. And the way that, you know, contemporary, again, mainstream, I want to qualify that, because there are philosophies and approaches to psychology and therapy that really challenge the mainstream. However, the mainstream is what's centered, right? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, centered. I mean, I can't even tell you one of the reasons or I should say, one of the things that lit a fire under my butt to get this Soul Medicine podcast started was seeing the rampant pathologizing that people are now doing to themselves, that the DSM has been so centered and has permeated society so much that we're now seeing people left, right, and center self-diagnosing, over-pathologizing. You know, everybody has this diagnosis and that diagnosis. And I'm sitting over here like, whoa, 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 hold up, right? Hold up. Take a look at that book and where that came from. And really, you know, the mainstream Eurocentric psychology is aimed at conformity to the system. It is aimed at pathologizing and making different anything that is not, you know, a quote unquote perfectly shapen cog in the machine, right? Whereas, like I was talking about earlier, you know, traditionally in our societies and our communities, all gifts were appreciated and upheld, and diversity was just a given of existence, right? It's just, we need everybody, however they come into the world, with their various gifts, with their different bodies, their different brains, their different, you know, all of the differences. We need all the differences to survive as a collective, which we still do. And so this idea of normal that was created and perpetuated by the DSM, you know, and continues to be perpetuated today, is really just about, well, how do we make everybody a well-shapen cog in the machine? And well, if you're too misshapen, well, you know, you're outside of the machine, you know, you're talking about these liabilities and stuff, right? And so, like, when we return to those Inuak Indigenous people's wisdoms and knowledges, it's just like, what? Like, we need to start questioning that, because it actually does an incredible amount of harm. Like, I feel like we're in a time right now where people maybe don't fully realize that or something because it's happening so much, and it's like, no, it's actually harmful for us to take on a diagnosis or a label as an identity, and to limit ourselves or pathologize ourselves in that way. Eduardo Duran, who is, like, you know, one of my the people that I really look up to the most in my work, one of the many, he wrote a book called Healing the Soul Wound, which I recommend every human on this planet reads, because it's just an incredible book. And he is an Indigenous psychologist from the Southwest in the States. He's, you know, he's in Montana now, but he's originally from the Southwest. And he talks about diagnosis as a naming ceremony. And I just so appreciated learning that concept, because it's like, yeah, that's what it is, you know, where when we receive our traditional names, our spirit names, or, you know, our kind of, I think of it as like my real name, right? The names that have meaning. We talked a little bit about names before we started. That, you know, that that real name of like who I am, that tells me about who I am, about my gifts, about what I bring to the collective, to the community. It also tells me about some of the things I'm going to struggle with or the challenges I'm going to face, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are, catches to being a good-hearted woman that I need to keep on top of and look after, so that I'm not slipping into the shadow side of those gifts and how they can also become harmful for me if I'm not looking after myself or looking after those gifts in a good way. Whereas something like diagnosis, if we are given that label, somebody puts that on us,
Mm-hmm.
accept that label, it now becomes part of our identity in a sense that can be very limiting, it can be very damaging, and it can keep people in these states of learned helplessness, right? I always like to acknowledge the and coming back to the and.
Yes.
I want to say, and I also acknowledge why people find comfort in diagnosis, because of the system that we're in, right? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be acknowledged, because we are in this system, in this machine that tells us, oh, if X, Y, and Z, then there's something wrong with you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when we've been taught that, and we're like the fish in the waters of colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't see that that's something that's just been imposed. Like, when we're taught that and we're taught in that way of thinking, then it can be a huge relief to get a diagnosis, because it's like, oh, finally, I know what's wrong with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we were, as you keep referring to, if we were to go back to that time before colonialism started happening, we wouldn't need that. We wouldn't need that, because we are born into the world with whatever gifts, sensitivities, brains that we're born in with. And we have those gifts to bring to the community. So there's no need to think that something's wrong with us, because we weren't treated as if something's wrong with us, right? I mean, I could give 1,000 examples of this in my work. Like I remember when I was first doing my dissertation work, I spoke with 16 knowledge carriers about how mental health services need to shift with Indigenous people. And, in two separate individual conversations, folks just brought up as an example people who are diagnosed with Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Just to illustrate, people today who are diagnosed with Down syndrome, intellectual disability, all these things, pre-colonialism, they both shared they're from different communities. Like in our communities, we understood those folks that are born with those particular gifts, like they're teaching the people, the community, about unconditional love, like about humility, about presence. There was no idea of like there's something wrong with them, or
Yeah.
what I mean. It's only within this machine, this system. And that goes for all forms of, the ways that people come into the world. We needed all brains. We still need all brains, right? There was there was no diagnosis of ADHD because there was no issue. What I mean? Like,
Yes.
you need those brains that work like that to be able to pick up certain aspects of what needs to happen for the collective, right? And so a big part of my work over the last, 15 plus years has been really challenging some of these ideologies that are pushed by dominating systems of psychology, right? Because it really is all about how do we get you to be a cog in the machine, right? And don't get me wrong, I am in those spaces that if somebody needs that diagnosis to help them access resources, because we do live in that system, there is a practicality. We are intertwined with that system. We are not in a time where our communities are living that way, right?
Yes.
So people, to survive in the system and society we live in, they require certain resources. And so absolutely, that diagnosis right now, because of how the system is set up right now, is required for access to particular resources. But when I'm working with folks, it's just supporting them in understanding that, right? Like, this doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You don't have a disability, a disorder, a dysfunction. It's just, if that label is going to help you get access to resources, just think of it that way. That's all that it is.
Yeah.
Right? It's a system that doesn't value a lot of gifts, actually, right? It values people being a part of the machine and being a producer in the machine, keeping the machine going.
Yes.
In these systems of power, privilege, oppression, and profit. And so, again, it's always the and of all the together, holding it all together. So someone can have a diagnosis and they can use that for the resources they need and know that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with them, right? And depending what is coming up for somebody, often, and this is what I'm talking about all the time in soul medicine, it's a conversation. It's guidance to wellness, right? Things like anxiety, feelings of depression, it's guidance to wellness. Like, we are at a time in mainstream psychology, I don't know if you know this, but the most recent edition of the DSM actually includes grief. So we can now give people a diagnosis of a disorder over their grief process, which is a fundamental part of being a human being, is grieving. We've always lost people since the beginning of time. And so it's now being pathologized, and the pharmaceutical industry is now researching medication for grief. And when I heard that, I just took a step back and I'm like, where are we as humanity that we're now trying to medicate grief, right? It's so important for people to see the systems for what they are, to begin to question them, critique them, and lean back into our medicine, because all of us have the power to heal ourselves, our communities, our families, ultimately the world, and one of the biggest numbers colonialism has done and continues to do is convince people that we don't have the power that we do have. And one of the ways that we are convinced that we don't have that power is through these systems of diagnosis and pathology. And like, oh, yes, well, I can't because of, that's what we're taught. That's what we learn. I can't do this because of X, Y, Z. I've heard people say in my work, well, I can't, yes, this is what I want to do, but I can't because of my historical trauma, right? And it's like, well, hang on a sec, right? Because whatever's coming through someone's body is just bringing conversations, and they're conversations toward wellness, healing, justice, environmental and social justice. You know what I mean? And those are important conversations to hear and be heard, and not to be pathologized into silence or pathologized into, symptom management, right? Because when we shut that down, we're shutting down the conversation that's trying to come through to let us know what we need to know, So yeah, it's those are understandings that come through Inuak Indigenous psychologies, and knowing that there's no pathology there, actually, I know, one of the questions that that you sent me to kind of think about is like a single piece of advice for listeners and viewers. And if I could say one thing, it would be to remind people that you are a perfectly whole, well human being, power and gifts and so much to offer the world. You are perfectly whole and well behind whatever is happening up here, right? So there's trauma up here, there's anxiety up here, there whatever is up here, you are still perfectly whole and well behind that, right? It's just listening to and engaging that conversation. and the and of it, just to speak to that, one more time with this, is that that's not to say it doesn't hurt, right? That, I mean, it's fucking excruciating. Some of the stuff that people go through and live through and survive, especially when you're surviving genocide, when you're surviving over 500 years of an attempted genocide, which is still ongoing. And I always say, we know it's still happening because we're still losing our people at higher rates, and so it's not to take away from how painful and excruciating and difficult surviving through all of that is, right? It's very real. It hurts. It fucking sucks. There's days you can't get out of bed. There's all of that there. And it's acknowledging that that you are also a perfectly whole, well human being in there. That's all still there too. And all the medicines that you need to heal yourself, which in turn heals your communities, your families, your ancestors, the generations to come, the whole world and the cosmos, because those ripples are huge. It's all in there, it's all in there in relation. So it's just having having that support, having those spaces, finding those places and those people that really support you, connecting in with the medicine that's already there. That's just trying to, right? Because it's trying to come through. And when we're able to listen to that, it's like, there's something there that's trying to help us. There's a medicine that's going to help rebalance whatever that pain and that hurt is, that's going to help us shift it, transform it, give it to the land, right? I always remind people that Iniwak Indigenous peoples have thousands and thousands and thousands of years of evidence-based, Indigenous evidence-based practice in how to work with trauma, grief, all the things we deal with in life. We have well-established, well-rooted practices for how to give things to the land, right?
Yes.
For how to move forth in healthy ways, like there's a healthy form of anger that is about addressing injustice, that's about addressing hurt and pain, and we can take action in good ways in that anger, right? Or and it can also be destructive. So it's finding those pathways. I always think of those ancient dynamics. They're the dynamics that are as ancient as the creation of, the dawn of time. The dynamics of creation and destruction, right? There will always be forces of destruction. There will always be forces of creation. That is life. And so it's really leaning into, as our little grain of sand human selves, really leaning into where is the creation there, right? Leaning into the power, leaning into all of that medicine that comes through it, even those difficult experiences that we survive through, that we live through. We can find medicines there that come forward to help us, right? It's not condoning or saying it's okay for this stuff to happen. It's not okay for people to hurt each other, to cause harm, to abuse. There's a lot of things happening in the world that are not okay. And for so long as they are happening, because even though it's not okay, it's a reality, leaning into those medicines that guide us into greater balance and healing as individuals and then ripple through the collective are key, right? So it's like, never underestimate the power that you as a person have in echoing healing and resistance and survivance and medicine through the world, right? The more of us that embody those values that you're talking about, those understandings, those traditional ways, the more we are supporting all of our relatives in moving forward in a good way.
Yeah, there's a lot to take away from just this just this alone, by the pre-conversation before question one, and then answering question one, and leading into different three themes that tie into question one, that tie away from question one, and tie into, is very much who we are as people. Is we're storytellers, and that is another reason behind all the other objectives that I've laid out for this podcast, is, again, to have that safe space and to have that community-based, Indigenous-led, where values are appreciated and practiced within each episode, and with on this platform. Is we're storytellers, and we're here to share our stories, we're here to share our experiences and our knowledge, and we have a large array of knowledge to share. And as you've said, time immemorial, we've had this knowledge carried through us through oral teachings, through conversations like you and me, like right now. And there are different human beings that have different ways of coping, different ways of learning, different ways of teaching, different ways of analyzing, of participating, of observing. And in our pre-colonialism way of life, way of living, the Indigenous way of life, and Indigenous is the people of Turtle Island. We were very much community-oriented, community-focused. Everyone had a gift to contribute. Again, going back to how I mentioned with the harvest and the hut was shared. There was no such thing as homelessness. If someone's teepee caught on fire by some event, or the harsh thunderstorms or the harsh wind or any amount of weather conditions, catastrophic conditions, happen to pass by, they weren't without a home. They weren't without housing. There was a community to lean on. They would say, come help. I need help in rebuilding my teepee because last night's storm blew it down, or because the fire from the fire pit in the home, the flames caught on fire and it burned down. We were not without communities and without families. And the word family ties into not just blood relations or blood quantum, like quantum amounts, which is BS. We're Indigenous through and through. There's no amount, or whether we're 1/8 or 8% or 1/4, 1/4, or half. We're Indigenous through and through. And we are the very spirit and the very being of that circle of life, which is from young to child to adult to old, and then it goes in a circle. And that's not the only circle that's important. And there's another circle where it's the child, where it's the parent, it's the grandparents, and then it's the parents. But in colonialism, that wouldn't be the correct order. As far as the colonial mindset, it would be child, parents, grandparents. No. Into Indigenous teachings, from what I've heard and learned and read, is it was the child, the grandparents, and the parents. Because the child, they were the vulnerable, but they were also the future. They were the protectors, they were the scientists, they were the doctors, they were the nurses, they were the mathematicians, they were the future of the tribe. And then it was the grandparents, because the grandparents were the ones that stayed close to the fire, close to the teepee. They were the ones that stayed at home, if you will, is what we called our tribal grounds where we resided. It was the grandparents who fed, who clothed, and who taught the children everything they needed to know, because the elders, the kokums and the mushums, the grandparents, they were the universities, they were the knowledge keepers, and they were the ones who fed the knowledge to the child. And then it's the parents who are on the last outer layer, on the last outer ring, because it was the parents who were closest to the outside. Their tasks and their roles were much more closest to the outside. They were the hunters and the gatherers. They were the ones that went on horseback, trailing into the forest, or trailing into the woods, or trailing out into the open plains to find the buffalo, to find the wild berries, to find the food and the shelter and the fur and whatever else was needed for the tribes on those grounds to live every day, to live their day-to-day life. So it's, again, coming out from the outside in. It's the parents, grandparents, child, going from the inside out, child, grandparents, parents, because again, the parents were on the forefront and they were the closest parameter to the outside world, outside of the tribal grounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I just love listening to you. Like, I feel like I'm sitting with a grandmother here. You have so much wisdom, and I just get goosebumps every time that you share, because it's, all of that is part of our pathways to wellness as families and communities. And as we pick up the pieces in the wake of this attempted genocide, and come back together and come into circle again, and you see those things happening again, those traditions reviving, and they look different than they did, but it's happening. And I just love that. Also, I have to say, one of my favorite things that you said is the grandparents were the universities.
Yes.
It's like, fuck yes. I just want to say that as like a recovering academic.
Yes.
That like 110%, I always say that, for myself as well, like the vast majority of my education in the work that I actually do through Muskiki, whether it's the counseling work, the workshops, all that stuff, it's what I've been learning with our Kitiayag, with our old people, the people that have those wisdoms. Those, I always say, I always say to my elders, like, yeah, you have like 8 PhDs, but it's like, I'm just gonna say it like now, because they are the universities.
Yes.
They are the true universities. And that's one of many reasons why I had to get out of there, because it's just such a colonial machine, and it's beautiful being outside of those walls and being back in those dynamics, and doing the work it needs to be, the way that it needs to be done, and side by side with those Kitiayag, with those old people that are teaching and mentoring us all the way. With Muskiki, we've got Kitiayag who help us, who advise us, who we reach out to for ceremony when we need it, because we know that the work that we do is ceremony, and that means a lot of challenges come up along the way, especially in the world we live in, right? Those forces of destruction are always trying to derail the light, the creation. And so, they help keep us on track. They help us with that, what I call spiritual hygiene, like you're talking about smudging, like in our work, that we do every day. Oh my gosh. There's days I smudge 9, 10 plus times, right? Because that spiritual hygiene in the world we live in today is so important to keep our pathways clear, and to stay, stay in the light, as there's so many different elements and energies of destruction that try to buck us off, try to discourage us, try to distract us, try to convince us or tell us that you're not worthy, you can't do this, just give up. I have this little saying for with that, when that voice comes to me of like, all right, well, thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your feedback.
Yes.
Because that critic's always going to pop up, and this is this is like a totally different, much longer conversation that we won't get into today. But there's a saying we have in IFOT that I learned there, that the critic is our best friend in hell, that tells us we can't, we shouldn't, whatever. It's interconnected to the critic that helped our people survive through genocide, and it still helps us survive when we're in situations where we need it, right? But it's good for us to come into relationship with that critic in a different way, to get beside it, and be able to say, all right, thank you for your feedback, right? Because now you're just trying to get in the way, and I'm not going to let you do that here. So yeah, but what an awesome conversation, Stella. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, of course.
You're an incredible young woman. I love listening to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, we haven't gotten to our other 5 questions, but I was wondering if you would want to participate in a part 2 of this episode. So this would be part 1, and this would air out tonight, because tonight is dedicated for episode 10. And then episode 11 would just be the part 2 of episode 10. So that we can finish our questions, but also we can finish our conversations, because there's a lot left that we haven't talked about aside from the questions, and branching off, webbing off from these questions and from our answers. And again, we're storytellers. We were born ready-made storytellers. We were the knowledge keepers for ourselves and for those around us who sit with us by the smudge.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's make a date. I know.
All right. Until next time.
Awesome. Westas.
Miigwech.